It is, though, in my humble estimation, it is a sign of our current state of ignorant bliss, I believe, that so few in positions of elected or appointed authority have actually very much knowledge and scholarly study on the law that actually grants them access to the power they currently wield when it comes to things like this dispute on the border. And this would apply to almost any member of Congress, to almost any member of an elected state legislature, whether it's the legislative body or the Senate body, or elected to a statewide office, or any of the civil officers. It applies to far too many people in academia, and it certainly applies to vast majorities of the population. Now, I believe that the reason for this is because the American sheeple have become convinced over years upon years, hell, generations of propaganda, that they are not required to know, but the most mundane and most basic of things when it comes to their own system and form of government. Well, here's the best part, though. What and the assumption then, or what the average Scherson, plural for sheeple, then concludes is that their almighty state and federal overlords have got this stuff on lockdown, and they don't need to know. It is not requisite for them to be knowledgeable or to be apprised of what the situation is and of what the law that they have agreed to be bound under and live under actually says that can be done. What does the law say? What does it permit? Where does it assign the authority? So when it comes to this, to these disputes over what I call alien friends, you may have heard me refer to this before, and I'm going to tell you before I even get into this that this is heavy intellectual and scholarly slogging for 5:15 and 6:15 a.m. Central and Eastern times in the morning, respectively. But it is something that is necessary, so if I do nothing more than cause a few of you to go, all right, when I get somewhere where I can actually look this up, I'm going to look it up. Yeah, there, I'm going to look it up there, and I'm going to see if you're telling the truth there, because I don't think you are. Fine, prove me wrong. But far too many have allowed this to go on unchecked without anyone seemingly, or I can't find anyone weighing in on the situation, folks, this is an existential threat here. An invasion force, by definition, whether it's one that comes in the form of of military under flag with weapons in order to cause immediate death and destruction, or whether it's one that comes in a more sanguine and familial and friendly and sympathetic form, as in children, makes no difference. If the end result or if the goal of the invasion is the same thing, well then, good men or men of good conscience should then be required to be at the ready and to be prepared to be called upon to oppose said invasion, and not to oppose it on some of the grounds that I've heard people oppose it on, but to oppose it on, number one, constitutional grounds, and as it applies to the Constitution, then on cultural and societal grounds. There are just some instances in which, and we have been trained our entire lives, we have been trained to not say the following, what I'm about to say. But there are just some instances where problems cannot be solved by importing new citizens into the mix. And there's a couple of reasons why the powers that be desire the new citizens to be imported into the mix. The business interest, the business concern wants the cheap labor that the American citizen will not perform for the price that the south of the border illegal will. Secondly, the American politician wants the vote for those that have no desire to or little desire to perform said service, but will pledge an allegiance and will become comfortable with and aligned with life under a very, very lucrative social welfare state. So you combine these two things together, and we have the current invasion. And we have current policies that purport to deal with said invasion. It should go without saying that a continent the size of ours, populated by 311 millions of people, is not in need of new blood to continue the bloodline or to continue the existence of the Union of States as it is currently comprised. That's just a fallacy. Anyone that says that is either lying or is ready to be fitted for a straitjacket and permanent residence inside a room that has padded walls. So let's get that out of the way. So there are two, as I set out here in the early moments of the show, there were two very clear, easily identifiable, historically reliable reasons why two schools of peoples that desire the illegal importation of the alien into our midst, whether the alien is a Mexican, whether they're a Sri Lankan or Uzbekistanian or a Guatemalan, matters not. Now, some may say, well, Mike, it does kind of matter because those that come from Asia aren't like those that come from South America. Well, that may be true, but for the sake of our argument here, you have to have the policy that would cover one would cover the other as well. So I went ahead and I went back to what I think is the model from the 18th century that we can look at, and we can try and determine who it is that has the power to deal with the illegal invasion force. And after having reread it again late last night and this morning, I'm here to tell you that the things that I told you earlier that were covered in the Virginia Assembly, in Kentucky and in Virginia in 1798, you know them as the resolutions for nullification and interposition. Sometimes we fail to look or we forget to look at what it was that they were trying to nullify. Well, they were trying to nullify the Alien and Sedition Acts that had been passed by the Congress of 1798, signed by President Adams. And in his report to the Virginia Assembly of 1799, little Jimmy Madison makes it perfectly crystal clear, inarguably clear, what it is that is at stake, what it is that the Congress has purported to assert authority over, and whether or not, now we're talking about James Madison here. He would know just a little bit about the federal Constitution. He would know just a little bit about the division of powers. And he would also know what powers were conferred to Congress and which ones, or to the federal Leviathan, wasn't a Leviathan at that time, but it was working on it, and which ones had been reserved to the states. So I think Madison is a pretty reliable source that ought to be above reproach. So if I tell you that Madison wrote something, he didn't say it, he wrote it. He sent this report to the Virginia legislature, that Madison wrote something, and we can use it today to settle this issue, or at least to get some guidance on where to go. Because the opinion of most people is that, well, it's the federal government's responsibility. They're the ones, they just control the border. They control the immigration. This is on them. Well, actually, as I've told you 1,000 billion, 100 gazillion times, that's the stress talking, man. That's not the Constitution talking. That is not correct. You have been sold a rotten bill of goods, and this is, I think, so people have been accusing me of late of not proposing solutions, so here we go, 2 days in a row. Now I'm going to try and help solve the problem. Well, the problem's going to be that no one's going to listen to me, but Maybe if I can inspire 20 of you to tell 20 more and you people can keep inspiring people, maybe they'll listen to you. Doubtful, well, let's give it a go. So what was at stake in 1798 when the Virginia Assembly met to field the resolution on interposing against the Alien and Sedition Act? Well, to the fathers of the Commonwealth of Virginia at the time, nothing more than their sovereignty as a state and their membership in the Union of States was at stake. James Madison believed that the Constitution itself was on trial, and that if proper measures were not enacted to stop what Congress and the Adams administration had done, that there wouldn't be a constitutional order in the future. That's how serious they took the Alien and Sedition Acts. And many, John Taylor of Caroline included, I think Jefferson secretly, or maybe in a corner of his mind, were ready to consider a schism of the Union should it be necessary. That's how serious the Alien and Sedition Act was. So what was it that the Alien and Sedition Act set out to do? Well, if we just deal with the alien part of it, what it basically said was that the President of the United States, that would be President Adams, had the sole express and explicit authority, should he deem or should he be informed or determine that any alien, doesn't matter if they were friendly or enemy, that was residing inside any of the territory of the United States, if he deemed them unfit to remain because he thought they were a threat, he could order their arrest, their detention, and finally their deportation. And as James Madison points out, well, in one instance you can, President Adams, and in another instance you can't. The one that we're going to focus on is the instance that you can't, which deals again with alien friends. And just to read from Madison's report of 1800, this is direct from the pen of James Madison. I was going to read the basically his narrative that he then gives the details on. Quote, "The next observation to be made is that much confusion and fallacy have been thrown into question by blending the two cases of aliens, members of a hostile nation, and aliens, members of a friendly nation or nations. These two cases are so obviously and so essentially distinct that it occasions no little surprise that the distinction should have been disregarded. And the surprise is so much the greater as it appears that the two cases are actually distinguished by two separate acts of Congress, passed at the same session and comprised in the same publication. The one providing for the case of, quote, alien enemies, close quote, the other, quote, concerning aliens, close quote, indiscriminately and consequently extending to aliens of every nation in peace and amity with the United States. With respect to alien enemies, now listen, here's where we glean our first distinction here. Quote, with respect to alien enemies, no doubt has been intimated as to the federal authority over them. The Constitution having expressly delegated to Congress the power to declare war against any nation, and of course to treat it and all its members as enemies. Okay, so just so you'll know, I've not been anything but trustworthy and have been telling you and advocating to you that you study this and learn this, the two distinctions between alien friends and alien enemies. And there it is right there from little Jimmy Madison himself. Now, let's deal with alien friends, shall we? What's the second distinction? Back to James Madison, report of 1799 to the Virginia Assembly. Quote, with respect to aliens who are not enemies, but members of nations in peace and amity with the United States, the power assumed by the act of Congress is denied to be constitutional, and it is accordingly against this act that the protest of the General Assembly is expressly and exclusively directed. Third observation is that were it admitted, as it is contended, that the act concerning aliens has for its object not a penal but a preventative justice, it would still remain to be proved that it comes within the constitutional power of the federal legislature, and if within its power, that the legislature has exercised it in a constitutional manner. In the administration of preventative justice, the following principles have been held sacred: that some probable ground of suspicion be exhibited before some judicial authority, that it be supported by oath or affirmation, that the party may avoid being thrown into confinement by finding pledges or sureties for his legal conduct sufficient in the judgment of some judicial authority, that he may have the benefit of a writ of habeas corpus, and thus obtain his release if wrongfully confined, and that he may at any time be discharged from his recognizance or his confinement and restored to his former liberty and rights on the order of the proper judicial authority, if it shall see sufficient cause. All these principles of the only preventative justice known to American jurisprudence are violated by the Alien Act. The ground of suspicion, and then he goes into, if you're talking about alien enemies here, without a declaration of war, how can you make someone out to be an enemy? And as Madison goes on to demonstrate, it's impossible. You can't. I mean, you could just claim it and say that you've done it, but that doesn't make it legal, and it doesn't make it right. And then he goes into some more descriptions here of the differences between alien friends and alien enemies. And where it gets really interesting to us is that when we get into who it is that can make the determination as to whether or not an alien friend can be admitted into a territory or a state within the United States. Now, folks, you have been told, and we are continually told, that it is the federal Congress and has the sole and supreme authority to import illegals, or to import, I should say legals, into their midst for whatever purpose. See the case of asparagus pickers in Washington State. As I informed the governor of that state, he didn't pay any attention to me, but I still informed him. As I informed the governor, sir, if you need legal workers to come in and pick asparagus because lazy-butted Americans won't do it, you do not have to have a permission slip from Obama or from Congress to do so. You're a sovereign state. Under the Constitution, and using, again, the separation of powers that we're supposed to have under the Constitution, as long as we're talking about alien friends here, well, then that's your determination to make. You and the people that live in that state, it's no business of Congress. So, Mike, how do you know that? You're such a smart guy. What did Madison say about that? Yeah, I see. Yeah, what did Madison say? Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what Madison wrote. Quote, one argument offered in justification of this power exercised over aliens is that the admission of them into the country being of favor, not of right, the favor is at all times revocable. To this argument, it might be answered that allowing the truth of the inference, it would be no proof of what is required. A question would still occur whether the Constitution had vested the discretionary power of admitting aliens in the federal government or in the state governments. Are you people listening to this? Is anyone other than me, just for my own personal edification, getting this? This is important stuff here. This changes the way we deal with these problems, and I think it changes it for the better. 866-95-PATRIOTS, our telephone number. So what is the question that Madison is asking here? Okay. Who was vested with the power to deal with admitting alien friends? The feds or the states? Folks, if you're driving, sit down, pull over. If you're standing, sit down. Here's the answer. James Madison. Report to the Virginia Assembly, 1799. Quote, but it cannot be a true inference that because the admission of an alien is a favor, the favor may be revoked at pleasure. A grant of land to an individual may be a favor, not of right. But the moment the grant is made, the favor becomes a right and must be forfeited before it can be taken away. To pardon a malefactor may be a favor, but the pardon is not, on that account, the less irrevocable. To admit an alien to naturalization is as much a favor as to admit him to reside in the country, yet it cannot be pretended that a person naturalized can be deprived of the benefit any more than a native citizen can be disenfranchised. Again, it is said that aliens not being parties to the Constitution, the rights and privileges which it secures cannot be at all claimed by them. To this reasoning also it might be answered that although aliens are not parties to the Constitution, it does not follow that the Constitution has vested in Congress an absolute power over them. The parties to the Constitution may have granted or retained or modified the power over aliens without regard to that particular consideration. But a more direct reply is that it does not follow, because aliens are not parties to the Constitution, as citizens are parties to it, that whilst they actually conform to it, they have no right to its protection. Aliens are not more parties to the laws than they are parties to the Constitution. Yet, it will not be disputed that as they owe, on one hand, a temporary obedience, they are entitled in return to their protection and advantage. If aliens had no rights under the Constitution, they might not only be banished, but even capitally punished without a jury or the other indictments to a fair trial, or incidents to a fair trial. But so far has a contrary principle been carried in every part of the United States that except on charges of treason, an alien has, besides all the common privileges, the special one of being tried by a jury, and then he gets into how a jury trial may occur. It is said further that by the law and practice of nations, alien may be removed at discretion for offenses against the law of nations, that Congress are authorized to define and punish such offenses, and that to be dangerous to the peace of society is, in aliens, one of those offenses. The distinction between alien enemies and alien friends is a clear and conclusive answer to this argument. Alien enemies are under the law of nations and liable to be punished for offenses against it. Alien friends, except in the single case of public ministers, are under the municipal law and must be tried and punished according to that law only. This argument also, now, ladies and gentlemen, you magistrates and cops out there, you administer municipal law. Prior to President Clinton getting involved in this, you did not answer to the federal Leviathan, nor should you. So Clinton, notwithstanding, to whom is your first authority, or to whom is your first allegiance? It is to the municipality under which the laws you are what? You are executing. You are enforcing. So what does this mean? Congress was never vested with a municipal authority, folks. They weren't. They still aren't. Who then deals with alien friends? The states. I mean, this is so clear-cut of a case and so easy of a distinction to make. It boggles the mind as to how we ever let this train run off the tracks as far as it has. Now, if you go and tell someone what I just read you from Madison, and I invite you to read the entire report, it is posted in today's pile of Prep Better for the Founders Pass members, and I've excerpted the pertinent parts of it. And of course, we'll turn what I just said into a transcript, and there are others on the site at mikechurch.com already about this. It boggles the mind as to how this has occurred, and as to how it has gone so far unchecked. Why hasn't anyone stood up and raised their hand and gone, that's not the way it always was, and that's probably not the way it ought to be? Because just imagine for a moment that the problem of alien friends was one that had to be dealt with by solely, as long as they're friends, not enemies, solely by the citizens, the state of Texas, state of Arizona, state of California, state of New Mexico. California may come to a different determination. They may say, hey, man, all the ones that Texas and Arizona doesn't want, come on down. Come on down. All the ones that California and Arizona and New Mexico are welcoming, we're going to go ahead and ask you to leave and go there, said what Texas would say. Why is this difficult to understand is beyond me.